for December 14th, 2020. We have some very interesting, important presentations this morning. The first is the City of Independence Electric Fund Balance presentation. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the City Council. Happy to share with you this evening our resiliency and cash balance policy for Independence Power and Light. The City Council, through the Independence for All strategic plan, really set a lot of important goals relative to financial management and financial sustainability. And one of those is providing more long-term analysis on how each of our major governmental funds are performing. Of course, we're very privileged and unique in our ability to operate our own municipally owned power plant. So this is one of the areas that we've spent some time focusing in the last few months. This is a presentation that was shared 2 weeks ago with the Public Utility Advisory Board and now being shared with the City Council this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our representatives from PFM, who is the financial advisor for the utilities for the City of Independence, and have them run through this.
Okay, thank you very much. I would just remind everyone to give us the highest quality broadcast on this. If you would mute your microphones while you are not speaking, that will help. Thank you very much. And we can.
I'm sorry, Madam Mayor.
I'm sorry. You can go ahead and begin with your presentation.
Thank you. My name is Chris Lover of Public Financial Management, and we've worked with the city over the past several months to answer a question that came up from the City Council a while ago on cash balances. And what PFM has provided here is essentially a risk analysis of the business of the utility, both the financial business and the operational business of the utility, with the idea of quantifying the level of risk that the utility is exposed to. And the idea here is that we will come up with a number that will be a cash balance that will be set and established as a target for IPL. And this target will be something that can live with the utility in terms of how do you budget and how do you frame many of the decisions of the utility. But at least what it does provide is some analytical rigor and analysis on what the number should be in terms of a cash balance level. What we've put together here is essentially a little more of a strategic presentation than what was presented to the PUAB a few weeks ago in mid-November. But we can, I think I want to go to one or two of the backup slides so that you can see kind of the level of detail that we've worked through with the utility, the leadership of the utility, the finance folks, as well as the PUAB. And as I move through my slides here, let me get this working. There we go. This is our agenda for today. We'll talk about why utilities do a cash balance study, what the observations we have from this study are of IPL. We talk about the risk analysis, so that's the section that gets into the numbers. Then, of course, what the next steps could be, as well as the data that supports all of this analysis. The purpose of this type of study really is to look at the risks that will arise over the course of a year of operations. As you know, IPL sets its rates, and then they really don't readjust them, whether revenues come in as expected or whether expenses come in higher than expected. So the idea here is that there's a level or a target cash balance could be used to address kind of the day-to-day variances, events, some of which could be fairly significant to a utility. The benefit is that not only does it help the utility weather these storms, but it provides a level of rate stability to your customers. So you don't have to go back to them for an emergency rate increase, or even, you could defer some rate increases if there's really a desire not to pass the full cost on immediately to your customers. And the final bullet on that top portion is that it helps with your credit ratings. We tend to present this to the credit rating agencies once it's fully approved, and they generally like this methodology because it does provide some analysis and rigor of the risks facing the utility. In general, we say that there are a few levels of risks, so we determine appropriate level of cash to address it. So these are revenues that might not materialize over the course of the year, your expenses being higher, and then two other categories. One is just the working capital. So this just means the delay it takes from IPL from the time it generates the kilowatt hour of electricity to the time it gets the payment from the customer. And you start thinking about this, that should at least be around 60 days because you might provide power on day one of the month, you might bill on the last day of the month, and then that customer has generally 3 to 4 weeks to pay you. So you can think about the expenses occurred the first day, you're not getting paid to the 60th day. And finally, that capital reserves are also addressed so that you can be flexible in terms of your projects and ensuring you're doing the renewal and replacement of the system and its system's appurtenances such that you have reliability. This isn't the only tool that folks use when they're thinking about cash balances or risk management. There's sound budgeting practices, insurance, the ability to hedge or to buy, for example, natural gas or electricity in the future. And finally, you can borrow for some risks that might just be too large to really address in this type of study. So if there aren't any questions, I'll go to our executive summary. And what I would like folks to realize here is we've done this bottoms-up review across those 4 risk areas: revenue risk, expense risk, working capital, and your capital improvement plan. So we've looked at this. We've tried to find a way to measure this risk, so putting a true dollar value to address the likelihood and the amount of what that risk might be. We put it into 3 separate levels: less conservative, meaning we don't put a lot of cash against that risk, kind of the middle of the road or moderate bin, or the more conservative level. And in general, for the more conservative level, that's where we felt the risk was more likely or a higher risk. For this study, we've concluded that you currently have on cash on hand at the utility of $82.9 million, and our recommended target level is 67. So you can see there's a bit of a difference there. So when you look at that difference, it comes out to about $15 million. And the other thing we point out is that we don't just pick a target of 67 million, we put a bandwidth around it, meaning plus or minus 10%, so that the finance staff has an ability to operate on a day-to-day basis and not worry about a single point target, but a nice range in which they can operate. This was reviewed a few weeks ago by the PUAB. I think that was probably a 90-minute to 2-hour discussion there in Independence. And you can see the way ahead. Here is our session tonight. Then if we answering your questions or adapting the policy, the idea is that it would be approved and then, of course, discussed with rating agencies, and then becomes a budgetary tool for IPL in the city. So a few observations and trends, if there aren't any questions. We'll start off with what is the available cash. And when you look at this middle column here, you might say, gee, IPL has close to $103 million on hand. So, what is behind that number, and is that really available for cash? And what we find is the answer is no, it's typically much less than that. And in general, about 20% of this $100 million is locked up and unavailable for kind of day-to-day uses if something were to arise. So you can see the first bin there of what money you can access is that you have a debt service reserve fund in which IPL and the city have covenanted to investors to maintain. So the debt service reserve was required to sell the bonds at that time at a very low interest rate, and you're just required to keep that on hand until the last bonds are finally mature. You have some funds that are not restricted by a legal covenant, but they're generally not available to you. And that's that second big bin there of about $3.7 million. And if you look at a few of these things, some customers have paid you in advance and you can't quite spend their money because you're going to need that money at $2.7 million in this case to produce that electricity down the road in 1 month or 2 months. So that's the second big bin that's not available. So when you do the math step, 102 minus the 16 gives you $86 million, and then you subtract the 3.7, you get to about $82.9 million that's available. So again, I think the point that we would make is that over $100 million sits on the balance sheet. Much of it, in this case, about 20%, is legally restricted or operationally restricted. You can't access. On our next slide, we get into some of the observations from this study. First thing, should be no surprise to folks, but the COVID-19 and the pandemic, just permeates a lot of the risk analysis in this study. Our federal programs have been helpful, but they've ended, and who knows if we're going to get a second round by the end of the year or before or after the inauguration. One day you listen to the news, it seems like it's going to happen, and the next day you're not sure. But that shows you the sense of uncertainty there. And that leads you to the idea that how good is this economic recovery that we're seeing? So when you look at this first three kind of big bullets here, it makes you say that with this COVID-19, that would argue for higher reserve levels. When you look at the middle section here, Independence is a city and your service territory, very good employment rates, meaning that your employment is now very high compared to what it was at the pandemic. So you put a lot of people back to work. You have some nice economic growth, not a racehorse, but just slow and steady. And you have a good customer base. There's not a lot of turnover with your residential, commercial, and largest customers. So this would argue a lower cash balance. And then finally, the last big set of bullets there, service territory. Some of the people, the ratepayers, have a low median income, which means the ability for IPL to raise rates is somewhat limited. Your unemployment rate is higher than the national average, but still rebounding nicely. And these, if you look historically, during the Great Recession, you've had some pretty significant decreases in your overall revenue and the power required of the system to your customers. So that was about a 6% reduction after the Great Recession. So this would point to higher cash balances. So again, kind of some conflicting information, and hopefully we'll put it all together for you. And by the time you leave this meeting, you'll understand some of the analytical pieces that went into saying this is what levels we think and why. A few more trends. Now this gets more into the energy markets, and there are probably three big points here. Natural gas prices drive our energy market, and natural gas prices have fallen quite a bit over the past few years as you've seen fracking become more prevalent. And what that means is you have a greater supply of natural gas and the prices fall. As a data point, in about a decade ago, natural gas was $7 for what we call an MMBTU, and now it's $4. The other statistic we look at is variability. So when you measure the variability, it's the same exact level as it was a decade ago. So a lower price, but just as much or if not more variability in prices. When you look at that second big bullet of the cost of power, meaning how much does it cost on the marketplace to buy a megawatt hour, you see the same trend, meaning 10 years ago, $33 for a megawatt hour, now it's 20. But again, the variability remains the same. So it's actually a little bit riskier in terms of the day-to-day changes in the price of electricity. IPL does belong to a regional energy market called SPP, and that's been very beneficial to the utility as you've been able to buy market power, basically power on the market without having a dedicated generating station. And that's been, a cheap alternative for you. And finally, renewable energy. Renewable energy, everyone kind of wants it. It can be very expensive in many instances, especially if you have older renewable facilities, but consumers want it. So we're finding that folks are buying or getting into renewable energy, and in many instances, it's a little more expensive than just buying energy that's created by a fossil fuel. If there aren't any questions, I'll get into some of the meat of the presentation here. So as you might recall, there are 4 big areas of risk we looked at. And the first one was what we call revenue risk. And what this page represents is a summary of the risk categories and the cash levels we felt should be set aside or earmarked to address this target cash balance level. And what I'd like to do is talk through the first one there, general sales decrease. So what this represents is the macroeconomic risk to the region, whether the region is Kansas City metropolitan area, just Independence, the state of Missouri, or the Midwest region. But what would happen if you had an economic slowdown like we saw in 08, 09, or is it more like what we saw for 2020? So what we felt is that when you look at past history and you look at the levels in which sales have declined historically in these troubled times, what makes the most sense. And in this case, we felt that the level of $7.4 million, it was the more conservative level, but is that amount that would address a general economic slowdown. And if I can get my computer to go to one of the slides here, we'll see if, yeah. So this is the detailed slide that we worked through with the PUAB. And what I'd like to focus on is that far right-hand column of the table at the top that says more conservative level. So what we assumed here was that in any given year, IPL has about $124 million of fixed costs. And these fixed costs have to be addressed whether or not you have a sales slowdown or sales growth. You're always going to have that level of costs. And think about this as representing salaries for your employees. You always provide a general level of power, or you can estimate what that general level of purchase power might be. And you can start aggregating all these costs together, and we came up with a fixed cost level for the utility of $124 million. We then looked historically and said, you know, how have sales varied in economic hardship? And you can see under variance explanation, we had a minor reduction in a few years. In 2010, it was 4%, and the year before it was 6%. And we then asked ourselves, well, how long do we think we're going to have this downturn? And in this instance, we said it's going to be about a year. So when you start doing the math of $124 million times a 6% variation times 1 year, that gives you the amount of $7.4 million. And it's this type of analytical process that we've gone through with virtually all of these risks. So I'll go back to my previous slide if there are any questions on how we accomplish that. But the general sales decrease represents the macroeconomic risk. The second category here, loss of a large customer, this represents the microeconomic risk. So what's going on at an individual level, meaning your commercial and industrial customers. And here we said this really represents two things. That customer goes out of business or leaves town, or the second thing might be is that customer decides to essentially generate his own power on site. And this is a trend PFM has observed, where you might have a large customer who will put in his own gas plant, small gas plant, and provide their own electricity, or probably even more importantly, when you look to the future, it might be that large customer putting a whole bunch of solar panels on the roof of their business. And just as an anecdotal note, you know, Walmart has a plan to be 50% renewable within 5 years. And when you start looking at the surface area of a Walmart store, you could put a whole lot of solar panels on top of that Walmart or in the parking lot, and you can start seeing that load of that type of a customer going away as they meet their own corporate goals, and that comes at the detriment to IPL. So the last category of revenue risk was interest income, and IPL has close to $100 million of which they invest on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And they've generated some nice returns on that. And the problem is that with COVID, the Federal Reserve has cut interest rates to a bare bones level. So as the finance staff goes to reimburse those funds, you're not going to get as much of a return. And those funds do a nice job of subsidizing the operations of the firm. They're a nice little dollar in the coffers of the utility. When you look at these three risks and you add them up here, you get $10.9 million to address your revenue risk. And our next step will be to go and talk about the expense risk. So if there are any questions, I'll go to expense risk. So here we had a few other risks that we initially sat down and talked to IPL and independents about, and some we didn't feel were appropriate given the operations of this utility versus other utilities, and some were appropriate. We're going to go over the ones that we feel are appropriate. The first one is loss of a large generating station. So here we talked about this being the loss of Nebraska City 2, meaning you have some type of maintenance problem where the plant just breaks down and can't operate and provide you the power you expect it to. So IPL would then be forced to make up for this power and buy it in the market. The risk comes when you go to buy that power in the market and maybe it's a very cold day in the winter or a very hot day in the summer where you're running your air conditioners and the like, and that power cost could be very, very high. On the converse, cold day in the winter, you might be running your electric heaters and you have a very high price of power at that point in time. So what we felt is that $1.3 million was an appropriate level to set aside in the event that any utility station, in this case, we modeled it out for Nebraska City 2, that went down for a period of time, which was about 1 month. You'd be forced to buy power in a higher interest rate environment. Under natural gas risk, we noticed that IPL basically has doubled its purchase of natural gas in the last few years. So you have a lot more exposure to that natural gas market. And if you recall, natural gas prices are much lower than they were a while ago, but the risk or the variability in those prices is very high. So again, if you're buying this natural gas and you happen to buy it the wrong day or the wrong week, such as what we saw last winter with the polar vortex, you could see quite a bit of dollars leaving the utility in that case. So here we felt that, given those greater reliance on natural gas, that $2.6 million level was about right to address this risk. For purchase power and capacity, the same concept, except for we looked at the cost of a megawatt hour, and we felt that this would be adequate, the $8.7 million, to address the increasing reliance of purchase power and capacity that IPL faces. And then finally, on renewable energy risk, what this represents is what happens when you have an expensive renewable asset, whether that's a solar plant put in 5 or 10 years ago, or some wind power that was put in 5 or 10 years ago, and the wind or the sun is just too strong, meaning the wind blows too hard or the sun shines too much, and your generation from those expensive resources is higher than you budgeted. So we looked at the renewable portfolio of IPL. We looked at the planned efficiency of it, and we went in and adjusted that by a few percentage points and determined that, of all the cash that we're recommending in the target, about $0.3 million could kind of address this risk of renewable energy production. At the end of the day, when you total up your expense risk, you get just shy of $13 million. And when you add it to our previous page, you get to about $24 million. So we're starting to build that cash balance level to the recommended point of $67 million. If there aren't any questions on expense risk, I'll go on to our next slide, which is really some of our bigger buckets. So the first big bucket I like to talk about is working capital. And in general, this was my discussion earlier in the presentation about how IPL can generate the electricity day one, but won't receive payment from a customer until 60 days after that. So there's generally a 60-day lag, or can be as much as a 60-day lag in payment. And IPL requires $340,000 a day to generally, as we say, keep the lights on and to basically run and operate. In this sense, you could say that maybe we use 60 days and that would get us to our cash level. But what we felt was 90 days would be more appropriate, primarily due to our COVID environment. And as I mentioned before, the uncertainty of COVID, the uncertainty of the economic conditions, the uncertainty of congressional action kind of leads you to be a little more risk averse and more conservative than to go to the moderate or lower levels of cash. And finally, the last big bucket on capital reserves. So this is the ability to do renewal and replacement of the system, the ability to provide reliable service, the ability to reprioritize projects mid-year in case something happens. It could help you address weather risk. Let's say you have a tornado come through and take out some transmission or distribution lines. So it's basically a fund or a level that gives you quite a bit of operational flexibility to ensure that the utility can keep the lights on and reliably keep them on. There are two ways that we think about this. If you go to your income statement, there's an annual depreciation expense, which is essentially an accounting drill, which says how much does our equipment depreciate or get worn down per year. And you pull that number, and that's about $19 million. You can also look at what kind of capital projects have you executed. We've seen some years where it's been close to $16 million, and others where it's about 12. And we felt that maybe on this, for this bucket here, let's not go to the extremes, but we'll pick that kind of average level of maintenance. We chose that 12.6 level. So you can see on this page alone, we're over 42 or $43 million here. When you add it to the two prior pages, that's how they get to the $67 million for a recommended level. And you can see the table in the top right here walks you back through the recommended levels across the four areas: a revenue risk of 10.9, the expense of 12.9, and then the other two we just talked about, working capital and your capital reserve. It gets you to $67 million. We also mentioned that the finance staff needs some flexibility. So we're recommending a bandwidth of plus or minus 10% of the target. And that gives you a range to operate where your upper level is about $73.7 million and your lower level is about $60 million. When you look at what your cash levels are, that $82.8 million, that means that you're over your target. So depending on how you look at it, you're between $9.1 million and $22 million over the target bandwidth, or about $15.8 million from the target itself. So the question comes up, of course, what can you do? And we looked at some options. You have some currently outstanding debt, some of which is callable today. So you could use basically some of this cash or all of this cash to defease these bonds and take them off of your balance sheet. And for every dollar you put in, you really enhance that transaction and improve those overall level of savings. You could say that since you're on item 3 here, another possible option is to use these dollars for capital improvement needs. As we saw before, your annual depreciation expense is $19 million, and we recommended 12.6 million, so quite a bit of difference from the book depreciation to what you're executing. And finally, you can make some targeted rate adjustments. Could rebate dollars back to your constituents. It would likely be a one-time event, and you'd hate to give back money this year to have to have a rate increase in a couple of years, but that's more of a policy decision than anything else. But either way, we think this last item here, the rating agencies will look at this, whether it's your current rating agency, Standard & Poor's, or the other two rating agencies. but they look at this favorably, and we don't feel adopting this lower bandwidth and this lower target from where you are, where you are at your current cash levels. It wouldn't be a risk to your overall credit rating. So in terms of next steps, I think we're here with you today on December 14th, and I think this is the date for an approval of the target and approval of the policy. And I think that wraps up my comments for the cash balance study.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I'm sure there's comments and questions from the council, so I'll just open it up for discussion.
This is DeLucci. I'm just wondering, I'm looking at the city charter, and it talks about depreciation accruals and amortization of bonds. And I heard annual amortization is 19 million, but I don't know what the figure would be, Chris, for amortization of bonds. What number would that be for us to have
I think
reasonable amortization of bonds?
There are, I think, two different accounting concepts here. The first one is the depreciation expense and accumulated depreciation. So this is the accounting entry of how much does your equipment wear down over the course of its lifetime. For example, a typical power plant might decline over 30 years, the same amount every single year. So that's what your depreciation expense represents. And your bond amortization just is how much of your bonds are you amortizing per year, or you're paying off per year. So think of this as your home mortgage, and the amortization of your mortgage is how much are you paying in principal versus how much are you paying in interest. And when we examine IPL, you don't have a lot of debt, so your mortgage really isn't that big. So the current debt structure is relatively conservative. It's not viewed unfavorably by rating agencies, and anything you could do to accelerate the amortization of your bonds, meaning paying them off earlier, would be viewed favorably and save the utility some nice dollars.
So can you tell me how much we're amortizing the bonds with? I mean, is it 5 million? Is it 10 million? I mean, what's a reasonable amortization of our bonds? I just don't know. I have no idea.
Yeah, I think, I don't know, Brian, if you have the CAFR open on what the debt service was, I could click it open if I need to.
Yeah, I can address. I don't actually have the CAFR open at this time, but council member, that is one of the things that our bond counsel double checks to make sure before we are able to. She gives a clean opinion before we issue debt, whether or not we've satisfied the charter on that amortization question that you have.
Well, I'm just looking at 3.17 to figure out how much does the charter say we should have in our piggy bank. And I heard 19 million for annual depreciation, but I have no idea what's reasonable for an amortization of bonds. I don't necessarily care what a new debt person would say is reasonable. I just wonder, as we sit here today, what is the amortization of bonds number? And maybe that's not a number I can hear tonight. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm looking for a slide I have that I could probably put up in about 2 seconds or maybe a little bit longer once I find it. But it shows the debt profile of the utility, and I can pull that up in a second.
So, Chris, while you're looking for that, Brian, I have a question for you or Zach. The debt service reserve, is that a percentage? I mean, I presume that that's based on the percentage Is that correct? Not a set dollar amount?
So typically on your debt service reserve to be adequate for to pass IRS rules, it can be no bigger than your highest annual debt service on that issue, and that's typically what you would see is that a reserve amount would be. Let's say we have a 15 years of debt. The reserve would be the highest debt service one of those 15 years. And so the reason it wouldn't come out to a dollar figure because it's a principal plus interest payment, but it's in effect, it has to do with the debt service payments each year, not a percentage so of the principal debt.
So is that established by policy, by law, by regulation?
So that's typically established when you're doing a bond sale. The underwriter, and in this case, that would be the Missouri Finance Authority, would help make that determination on what level it should be in order to get the best market value on the bonds. So the more reserve you have, the safer that investment is, and so the interest rates would be a little bit better the higher reserve. But again, there's some IRS limits on that, but that typically would be established when you're entering into a debt issue with the underwriter.
Okay, and this slide that Chris has now brought up sort of helps to illustrate that. Chris, you want to explain this?
Sure. So this is the overall debt service of IPL. So this is the principal plus the interest payments. So, you know, it's about $10 million a year, very conservative level of payments. And then you have a bump up here in the year 2037. But you also have a debt service reserve fund in here that'll help bring that down to a much more manageable level. But incorporated in with each color of the bar is both the principal and interest component of it. So, I mean, it doesn't address specifically your question about what's the payoff per year of the bonds, but it just shows you kind of the aggregate amount of it.
Okay. Are there any other comments or questions from the council?
Yes, I have some.
Yep.
More than one. Can you hear me? I guess my speaker's playing games. I'm not real sure.
Yeah, no, we can hear you. It's fine.
Oh, great. First question is that Mr. City Manager or Power and Light or whatever, have we ever dipped into our reserves ever in the history of Power and Light?
I can't.
Storms, hurricanes, whatever.
To my council member, I can only go far back as the last 4 years as manager, and in that time, no, we've not tapped our reserves. I don't know about the history, but we'd certainly be happy to get that for you.
Sure. My biggest issues here is that Councilwoman DeLucci, quite a few years ago, I don't remember exact years, backed this down to 25 million, which I think was a 30-day. Somewhere in the thing has changed to 63 days. Now we're to 209 days, $67 million. We've never touched it in the history of Power and Light. As a ratepayer, I would see this as like, you don't want to give me my money back in rate reduction or whatever. I mean, we're going from 25 to 67. We're almost going 3 times as much. I have a hard time swallowing that. Could you give me shed some light on that? Besides, I mean, there's a lot of, this presentation was a lot of negatives, and for instance, our large customers may be experiencing financial difficulty. Well, if they haven't done it by now, I very seriously doubt if they're going to. Stuff like that, I guess I'm a positive person. This is more of a negative thing for me. We get into the natural gas prices. You know, we adjust these natural gas prices on the FCA. It's not done in rates. It does boil down to that, but that's why we have fuel cost adjustments. That's part of that, the FCA. So, I mean, if gas goes up, yes, the price goes up, but it's of the electricity, but it's also done through the through that adjustment. I'm just really concerned about this increase in the funds there. I mean, I've always been after this since day one, is rate reduction. I figured out maybe a better way to do this was to do like the co-ops. I would check out there to people or whatever. And then next year, if there wasn't any money, then you wouldn't have to do that. But just, it looks like to me, we're trying to hide a lot of money. We went from 27 million to 67 million. We've never had an issue in the history, at least 35 years that I know, we never touched reserve. We didn't even come close. I'm having a real hard time getting over that part.
Yeah, I don't think we're trying to hide it necessarily. That's why we brought this to you tonight, so that the council and then the PUAB a few weeks ago could see precisely where the fund is. In fact, I think it's a financial best practice that we should do this on a pretty frequent and regular basis. And this is something that's, you know, not been part of the business plan as far as I could tell in the past. So I'm glad we're making that a part of the business plan now. But the idea here tonight is to give the council and those watching an idea of where we're at financially so that we can set those targets and policies. We're intending to bring that to the council next Monday night. And then, yeah, like I said, probably should do this on a routine basis just because those funds don't remain stagnant. They ebb and flow, you know, over periods of time. So if we would do this more regularly, I think we would manage those wild swings that you're speaking to.
Sure. And you know, a lot of questions, you know, we went and started talking about revenues. If you look at the history of Power and Light, revenues have always stayed pretty much the same. Not been any big increases. And then all of a sudden we throw all these negatives in here. I'm just really concerned about the amount of reserves there. I am very much for paying off bonds. I have no problem with that. But I also think that these ratepayers in this city deserve a break. We got a lot of money sitting there, quite a bit. And it just looks very, very, it's not very transparent that we're running these numbers up to that extreme. I could see a little bit maybe if people are really thinking that this pandemic has affected these utilities that bad, but I just don't see this big increase. I just totally do not agree with it. That's all I have.
So,
Madam
Mr. Mayor, oh, I'm sorry. Let me just, I want to just make sure that I'm understanding the purpose of this presentation and what we are asking to consider, because I wholeheartedly agree with Councilman Huff, is there's no need for us to hang on to extra, any kind of extra money when we have debt, when we have capital improvement needs, when we have rate problems, when we have people who are needing our assistance. So I totally agree with that. We have talked about this at the Utility Rates Committee when that was still in existence, about developing some financial policies for the utility, which we did for the general fund before Mr. Walker was city manager. I think that was still under John Pinch when he was city manager that we started to establish some financial policies. And we've talked about this repeatedly with the IPL directors and our finance directors and the city manager within that committee. And I am quite certain at the council level. So I see this as a step in the right direction to start establishing these financial policies so we don't find ourselves, our ratepayers don't find themselves in the future sitting on a heap of money that isn't being utilized for the correct purposes. We ultimately, if my memory serves me correctly, and please correct me, Mr. City Manager, if I got this wrong, was we had asked the PUAB to undergo that process of setting priorities for the utilities. Is there a recommendation from the PUAB on this? Has the PUAB voted on or provided their staff with those priorities?
The PUAB approved this policy that we're intending to bring you next week, the cash reserve policy. They did not adopt a recommended list of priorities or a strategic plan. My staff interviewed each member of the PUAB individually. I think there were consensus on the items that they want to recommend that we focus on, but there was never an adoption of a formal work plan in terms of identifying those and prioritizing those.
Okay. So if I'm clear what this purpose of this presentation is this evening is to address the problem which Councilman Huff has laid out for us, is when you have excess revenues, and I hate using that term, but that's pretty much what it is. When you have excess cash on hand, what are you to do with it? And if I understand correctly, this policy would say you should use it in this order. Pay off debt, invest in capital improvement, return to ratepayers. My question is, assuming there's not enough excess revenue to do all of those things, how is it determined how much debt you retire, then which capital improvement projects you do, and then what you return to the ratepayers either as a one-time rebate or as a suspension and rate increases. I mean, whatever form that comes in. So that's the part that I'm unclear on, because I think the charter does articulate where the money has to be spent first, if I understand it correctly from Councilmember DeLucy's comments.
Yeah, the charter does lay out, the requirements that need to be satisfied and contemplated prior to applying this to rate reduction for the customers of the utility. The presentation that Chris has here, and if Chris has more detail that he'd like to fill in on here, I would ask him to, but the presentation that Chris is prepared to is a holistic look at the fund. Council has adopted the 67 or 63 days cash reserve policy. This is that holistic look, again, because these funds oscillate and vacillate over time. There's been years where directors have recommended that we issue debt in order to do capital projects, and there's been years where we find ourselves now where we've got this $16 million. What Chris's presentation looks at is what is kind of that range that we want to be in to make sure we have adequate working capital to address the needs of the utility, operating and capital, satisfying debt service, and then also the second part of that is looking at how do we best apply what we've got above and beyond that amount right now. Chris, I would like you to fill in the gaps that I missed there, but that's kind of the general nature of what we're trying to get the council's understanding of tonight, correct?
Correct. And I guess I'd add a few things. So let me see and go back a couple slides. Sorry, as I go through this inelegantly. A lot of these numbers, or the majority of these numbers, are all based in historical review of what has happened in the past. So, for example, the general sales decrease, yes, a little negative to think that, COVID might have a large impact, but still a lot of uncertainty. And we just said, well, what if 2021 or 2022 looks like it's in 2009? What would that impact be? And when you go across these categories, whether we're looking at historical variations in sales or historical variations in commodity prices, it kind of shows you the risk that the utility faces operationally as well as financially. The other thing I'd point out is that On your working capital, we have this $340,000 a day to meet the general expenses of the utility, but embedded in there is not only your operating expenses, but your debt service coverage. So being able to pay your debt off, plus your required margin of 10% that you're required to have. Plus you also put your pilot payments in there, showing that, IPL does make a contribution back to the city that keeps the city running. And, the ability for the utility to do that is kind of important. And we've seen instances with other issuers where, they have a bad year. Guess what? The city still expects the pilot to come in. So that's, I guess, 2 points right there. And then I have a slide on the rating agencies. It might take me a second to find it here. But these are some comparable utilities that we reviewed with the PUAB and with the finance staff. So these are utilities from, sort of regionally, but sort of coast to coast too. You have some folks down in Florida. We tried to make them as similar in operating revenue or customers as IPL. And if you look under kind of the middle here, you could see the days cash. And, if we're recommending about 200 days cash for IPL, you can see there's quite a few that are above you and a few that are below you. So we think this kind of strikes the balance of putting you, in the middle of the pack while also ensuring there's not a threat of a ratings downgrade, which could be important in the coming couple of years as you come into the market to issue debt to refund, for example, your 2012 bonds or to undertake new capital projects. So we felt that with this peer analysis, you can see it's not exactly, out of the wheelhouse in terms of base cash.
So Mayor, just to wrap that back up for you then, what we're really trying to accomplish with the council is to set policies that would provide an appropriate range, and appropriate being defined by this governing body as a policy of where do we need to be at in order to satisfy our requirements, so that we don't swing to one end where we've got $16 million above and beyond what we think we need, or we don't swing to another end. Like when I was the assistant manager in 2015, we had to issue debt to cover our general capital maintenance budget for Independence Power and Light. We would like to be in something of a sweet spot where we could hit that appropriate range. And my recommendation would be that we look at this routinely and regularly to define what appropriate and regular means. But that first step with this policy that the council would be asked to consider and adopt next Monday night.
Okay.
Mayor?
Excuse me, Madam Mayor, I just have a few more questions.
Yes.
Chris, of that available and unrestricted number, how much of that money is borrowed?
Let me see. Available, but not unrestricted and available. That I think that's it's kind of hard to say, because most of the stuff you've borrowed money for is for capital projects. So this is just the amount of cash that sits on on your balance sheet. So I don't think any of this $82 million was borrowed.
Okay. And then I understand that you're an accountant and God bless you for it. I'm just reading the charter and I understand you're looking at all these other variables. I'm just looking at my charter, which is sort of that's my roadmap. And I understand depreciation accrual is the 19 million. I do not have a number for amortization of bonds. And I don't know if there is an industry standard that, you always keep 5% of the outstanding bond indebtedness back as payment for amortization of bonds. I don't know. And I also don't have a number for a reasonable accumulation of surplus. And is that reasonable accumulation of surplus equivalent to the amount reserved for revenue risk, which would be 10.9 million? Or is there another industry standard that I should be concerned with?
So I would think one thing to first address the bond amortization, meaning how much principal are you paying down a year? I would say there's no real industry standard.
Okay.
Most issuers will say, if I need to build a new plant, I'm going to issue 30 years, a debt that amortizes over 30 years. Very, very similar to what you would do with your house, like a 30-year mortgage. And then a few other issuers who might be more conservative or higher rated, they might just say, I want to pay this off in 15 years, so I have more flexibility in the future. And they'll kind of bite the bullet and have more debt service in the first 15 to have the flexibility starting in year 16. So it's kind of like the decision you make. Do you go for a 30-year mortgage or a 15-year mortgage? And what drives that decision? I will say there's some leverage metrics, the rating, debt metrics the rating agencies look at, and they basically say, they have some I call it a 70% debt to equity ratio or capitalization ratio, and you folks are well below that.
Is the amount we pay on debt reduction on the interest part of the unrestricted and available number of 82.9 million? If I know I'm paying $16 million in interest, is that restricted so that it's now part of my 82.9? Do you see what I'm saying?
The 82.9 shows you how much cash you have available in which you would be able to pay your debt service out of that 82.
Okay, so it's part of that 82. Okay. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, are there any other comments or
Mayor,
questions?
Mayor?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to go back to some of these things that in the past. I don't want to dwell on too much, but back a couple of years ago, a few of you were on the council, using there, of course, introduced a 4% to 2%. Council agreed 6% overall, chastised by some of the other council members there that we would have Power and Light would be broke because of this action. And we would see rates increases of 11%. Of course, you put a moratorium on this for 5 years, but it amazes me that supposedly for all this that we was going to go broke, and now we have more money than we've ever had out there. I don't understand why we're playing games with all this money for 209 days worth of reserve. I'm just having a real hard time with that. That's all I have this evening on it.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
Madam Mayor, if I may. So I want to say about 3 years ago, the council decided to do a policy to where we'd have 62, 63 days of cash reserve on hand for emergencies and stuff. So obviously that dollar amount's moving up to where it's more than that. So the policy before the council, what we need to consider is what we're going to do. So as we're talking about as a possible way to reduce that savings and do something with that, either debt service reduction or allocating one-time payback to ratepayers. As we discussed the ratepayer payback, if that is a part of a serious discussion, we need to realize that not all ratepayers, if you will get a reduction, because a lot of the some renters have that wrapped into their renter's fee. So that's tied into that. So they would not necessarily see any type of payment back to them as being a ratepayer, even though they kind of technically are paying a rent that has their utility service put into that. So that needs to be part of a discussion, or at least a thought of. And two, I guess my question is, in theory, that if we were to pay down debt service, and that would give us ability to have more money in a longer range forecast to where we could possibly do more debt service reductions and or maybe possibly larger payable rates back to the ratepayer. Is that kind of a good assumption of what I'm thinking about that?
Yeah, council member, I'll jump in there. And while I'm doing that, I might ask Chris to jump back to that slide where he had the different options or alternatives of how the council could apply some of this. Chris, if you don't mind toggling to that, but generally speaking, yeah, our recommendation here is really that you apply a great deal of this toward defeasance of those bonds, because you're going to create cash flow that's going to allow the council to then contemplate a couple of things. Either by doing 1 and 2, you really open up the doors to do 3 and 4. Okay, and you've got some pretty important investments coming down the line, as we talked about the last several years. It was just 2 years ago that we had the Energy Master Plan, and it spoke to the issue of base load and those combustion turbines, or CTs, you might remember us referring to those as. Well, 2 years later, we're now 3 to 8 years out from needing to replace those. And it's not really something you go buy off the shelf at Cargo Largo. It's going to take a little bit of time to get that decision made and installed and up and running. And then, also then this issue of rate adjustments is also an important one that needs to be considered. So point being, you free up your cash that you're applying toward debt service now. You've got cash on hand that will allow you to do these other items that are equally important for the council and our community.
Okay. Other comments or questions? Yes, Councilman.
I do have a question too. A couple questions for City Manager. What level of input was provided by IPL for this particular study? And then, while we're talking about making decisions, are we going to discuss who will have the authority to draw down these newly established fund accounts, and are we going to establish the purpose that we would provide the spending for?
This was mostly a project involving our finance administration department. I mean, I think some senior staff at Power and Light was consulted if they needed to pull data, but because we're largely dealing with issues of cash flow, this was a a finance administration project. Not really asking as part of this for the council to create any new funds or anything like that. I'm just more along the lines of adopting policies and guidelines about how we would apply this $15 to $16 million that's been identified through this analysis. Any applications of fund is still going to need to follow our current procurement process for whatever intended use. So this wouldn't create or alleviate any of those requirements that are already in place.
Well, I was just, I agreed with the mayor when her questioning of what and how, but I also wanted to hear the who will make these decisions of how we're going to spend these funds. And also, I think I know the answer to this, but I wanted to ask too, what did we spend on this this study?
I know that question came up at PUAB, but I don't recall. Chris, could you refer to that?
Yeah, I think it's $50,000 if I recall correctly, what the engagement letter says.
And who requested the study, Mr. City Manager?
We brought this to council as part of the deliverables of the strategic plan. Like I mentioned in my opening remarks, the long-range financial planning and analysis and establishing target fund policies for each of our governmental funds. So we recommended it and PFM for approval and got that council blessing.
Madam Mayor, Mr. Walker, just I wanted to make sure I heard you right. The PUAB did not provide a list of priorities or goals, or they weren't able to get their heads together on that?
In our interviews with them, so each member was sat down with Assistant City Manager Adam Norris, who I've assigned to oversee the utilities day to day, and then Director Jim Nail. They sat down, did one-on-one interviews, and I would tell you the same common themes emerged in each of those interviews. What unfolded from there was we brought back the summary of what we had heard in those interviews. PUAB developed like a rubric or a matrix, if you will, of how they wanted to score and prioritize those. And they were not able to reach consensus on that. So they've identified a common set of deliverables or a work plan, if you will, but it wasn't ultimately, I don't want to misrepresent their intentions. It was never then officially voted on and adopted by that board to be sent to the city council for your consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions on this presentation? Mr. City Manager, did the PUAB hold a hearing regarding this?
No, this was presented to them at the last meeting they had, but no public hearing was held on that, Mayor.
Well, I have two thoughts, additional thoughts, I should say. One is the council has requested that the PUAB provide us with their priorities on a strategic plan. So they need to complete that. That is that's a obligation that they have, is to fulfill a request made by the council. So I would encourage them to continue to work on that so that we can move forward and bring us forward something that they can agree upon, so that we know where we're heading with that. That's number one. Number two, the other side of that coin is I feel that this council is obligated to vote on the recommendation brought forward with the PUAB, from the PUAB, which this is the recommendation of the PUAB. So I am, very comfortable. Madam City Clerk, my question is, can we have, this is anticipated to come forward next week as a resolution, which would not give really any formal input for public comment on it. Can we either schedule a public hearing at the council level on this, or an alternative is, rather than bring it forward as a resolution, bring it forward as an ordinance so it can get 2 readings and allow some time for some public input if there is any?
I'd need a little bit of time to check and see what the requirements are for you to put a public hearing on the agenda, but I can do some research on that this evening or tomorrow morning, and I can get back to the council on that tomorrow.
We typically don't have public hearings on resolutions, is the reason I'm asking procedurally how that would work. But I think this is a very important decision for this council to make. I still, along with Councilman Steinmeier, it's great to have a policy, and I agree with having the policy, but ultimately, when we have this $15 million, how much of it's going towards each of these categories? Because $15 million isn't going to allow us to fulfill all 4. And I'm just using that as an example of our current situation. So I would like some more clarity upon who decides how much is going towards each one of these. And I know a lot of that, Mr. City Manager, is based on, which bonds are, can be paid off and are callable and all of that. But I think that needs to be more clear for me as to who's going to make those decisions. So those are my, 3 requests for information prior to having this appear on the agenda next week, and I guess we'll decide during the week how to accommodate if it's the consensus of the council to allow for some public input.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
I really think now that you've said it, it makes a lot of sense. I think it'd be really wise to have a public hearing on this. I don't know how much of a hurry we're in if we can't squeeze it in before our vote, if we can't move the vote back to have a public hearing. I really think that'd be wise. The folks in this town don't like feeling like stuff is rushed or happening without a full understanding. So I'm in support of that.
So we don't need to take any action this evening on this. As I said, it was anticipated that this would come on as a resolution for Monday, but Mr. Walker, let's spend the next day or so figuring out, how to bring this forward to the next step. And, you can speak with the council members individually and determine everybody's desire on how to do a public hearing.
My pleasure. We will do so.
Okay, any other comments or questions on this presentation?
If
Yes.
they would check, I think Adam Norris I know he was there, and Jim now, but I believe that the PUAB recommended less than 67 million, and they voted on it and approved less than $67 million. I don't remember the exact number. Seemed like it was on the lower side of maybe the 10% or something, but they did vote on it and approve a reduced amount of that recommended level. I do recall that, if someone can check on it.
Well, we'll work up the, we'll work up the cover sheet and the language for the resolution or ordinance or whatever we'll be voting on to reflect that. Okay. Next, something a little less technical is the Englewood Arts update, Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor and members of the council. A couple of years ago, the city acquired the former Comprehensive Mental Health Services building in Englewood, large property in a key strategic commercial area for the city. Ultimately, we acquired that with the idea of trying to find a suitable developer that would help further the strategic goals of the Englewood Arts District. Kind of neat public-private partnership emerged where a group of grassroots business owners and arts enthusiasts came together to acquire that property from the city at the same price that the city had previously acquired it. So the taxpayers of this community weren't out any dollars on that. But this project has moved leaps and bounds ahead in the time since the city made that transaction. So this evening we have the Executive Director of Englewood Arts, Michael Baxley, here, and Michael's going to share a little bit of the many exciting accomplishments that are afoot in Englewood with you and where things are headed as we move into 2021. So I will turn it over to Mr. Baxley.
Okay, thank you, Mr. City Manager. Mr. Baxley, take it away.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager, and thank you, Madam Mayor. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Mike, you muted yourself.
Yep, you muted yourself.
There you go.
How about now? There we go. All right. I just wanted to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to give you a quick update. What I'd like to do is spend the next maybe 10 minutes going through some slides with you and then save a little bit of room for questions at the end, should anybody have questions. I did want to start with just I really appreciate the City Council's support, and I know a lot of you have been following Englewood Arts from the inception or even played a role specifically in the inception of Englewood Arts. But I want to recap and kind of start from the top so we're all on the same page, and you can kind of hear our voice and our mission and where we're at. and then I'm going to show you some updates, and then we'll wrap it up here. So starting from the top, Inglewood Arts is a two-pronged organization that's using arts as the catalyst for community improvement. And we're doing it through the one prong, which is the renovation of the former CMH medical building into a 30,000 square foot arts center that's community-based. And the other prong of our organization deals with affordable and sustainable housing. Right now, our biggest focus is on the renovation and the completion of a community-based arts center and working with our many partners.
Mike, you're muted again.
I think I'm on. Yeah, I apologize. I don't know what's causing that. Let me move some things out of the way. Okay, so here we are at some photos of the building when we acquired this building back in February of this year. On the bottom left, a rendering of by Terry Meek of what the building could be, and a photo on the right of where we are today. Officially, construction started in July of this year, and with many partners and several foundation grants made it possible for us to start. In the middle of the pandemic, we've had to move slow. So we have just focused on keeping people separate on floors. We've really had a very small crew, and our executive director, Monty Short, is overseeing the construction. And he's done a wonderful job of keeping us on budget, but moving forward in a really safe way. So I'm going to come back to some of these photos here. And I apologize. I don't know why my computer wants to keep muting. But to give you an overview, this is an overview of the type of programming we're going to have in the Arts Center building. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time drilling down on each thing, but we'll have a variety of different programming. And I'm going to go just quickly floor by floor through this technically 4-story building and highlight what is taking place. As a community arts center, we want to engage the community. We also want to engage the arts community. But we realized early on that Kansas City is rich with art, has many art things, but what we want to do is fill the gaps in the arts community. So we put some initial programming in place, but the building has been gutted. All the walls have been removed. We've removed over 150,000 pounds of material from the building, and now it's wide open space for creative making. The programming that we're putting in place, again, is identifying what we think are the needs, listening to the artists. We have a community committee that's chaired by Tammy Parsons, and she's been connecting with the community and the arts community and listening to what the needs are. And these are just some immediate needs we've identified. One of the really exciting things about the Arts Center that you'll see right as you walk in on the first floor will be a glass blowing studio. Currently, there are no public community glass studios in the entire region. The Omaha Hot Shops are the closest that you'll find. So this will be unique to not just Independence, but it's going to be unique to the entire region. It'll be quite a draw. There are people living in Independence as citizens that have experience in glass blowing that are not practicing because they don't have that as an option available to them. We also will have some woodworking, a small ceramics component for kids' classes and hands-on activities. On the first floor, we'll also have a community stage. So we're working with a local partner, the West End Connection, and they'll be helping us coordinate ticketed performances and other programs that'll be engaging for the community. We're also working with the Puppetry Arts Institute to give them a larger stage that's also handicap accessible for children to come and be able to do puppet shows and be able to walk right down the street. So these are some things that are happening just on the first floor alone. The goal is for when you walk into the first floor, we want you to experience all 3 prongs of the arts, which is culinary arts, visual arts, and performing arts. The first floor I did skip over. We'll have a small culinary residency program in partnership with the Innovation Cafe, or I'm sorry, the Innovation Center. It's called the Innovation Cafe, and it'll give residents an opportunity to experiment and try different culinary creations on the public. So when you come in to the Arts Center, you'll have an opportunity to try something unique and different. And the residents will have an opportunity to try taking risk with culinary creations in a safe environment. Moving up to the second floor quickly is our community classrooms. And actually, this is going to be one of the most important elements of the Arts Center, because this is where we connect to the people of Independence and the region. And so we'll be offering a variety of different adult and kids classes. We've already identified many partners in the community, especially the Independence School District with their Pathways program. We'd like to have after-school programs as well as summer art camps. Hope House has a location right in Inglewood. We'd like to get the folks out of the Hope House and over to the Arts Center, have the kids working in clay and paint and doing all sorts of artistic activities. We recognize that, you know, the independent schools, I think, are phenomenal, and I really enjoyed connecting with them. But again, what happens in the summer, the schools are limited in what they can do, and in the evenings, after school programs. So we really want to fill the gap in the programming that the wonderful programming that the school's already doing. We'll also be working with veterans and with Mid-America Regional Council and their Aging in Place program to get seniors over in the Arts Center as well. So this Arts Center really is for everybody. It's not just for artists. It's to get creativity and community together. On the third floor is a large open space for, now this is going to be a lot of resident artists and a lot of makers. So this is a wide open space where there'll be painting and murals, fiber, and other open space for creativity. So if you can imagine a wide open space, this is an example of another maker space, but wide open space where artists can make murals and things they wouldn't have the space to do otherwise. And the community will be able to go right in there and watch the artist creating and hopefully get inspired to want to take a class or purchase a piece of art, anything in those lines. I want to go ahead and move on to the slides of the building, talking about how we started renovation in July. Since then, one of the first things we wanted to do was to show the community that we're doing a lot on the inside. So we felt like we needed to do something on the outside. And so we got a wonderful in-kind donation from Mean Green Blasting, as well as a very generous grant from the Independent Civic Council. We asked for $4,000 to create a mural on the limestone that you see being blasted. And the Civic Council doubled our request and gave us $8,000 to fully fund that installation. So you'll see an example of that here shortly. We've had many community members coming together to help with the renovation. So the prior slide was a photo of M&M Painting, who is doing all the painting in kind with Sherwin Williams. Now back to these photos, you can see the sandblasting, what the limestone looked like prior and what it looks like now on the right. And since then, we've put this wonderful mural up, but you can see already that the building is starting to take shape. And here we are creating the frame and a sign out front so people can identify and find more information on our website. I'm just going to keep moving here. A wonderful example of the restoration going on the inside, using modern colors with accents and pops of color. So this is one of the beams, the before and after of the very same beam. I think this photo does a really nice job of showing the quality of the renovation we're doing. We're not just slapping paint on. We have artists coming in and really doing a great job. Here's a photo of the ceiling being painted, courtesy of M&M Painting and Sherwin Williams Paint is providing all the paint. And so they're painting the ceiling a bright white, which is really reflective and gives a white cube space to bring more light in and really brighten up the place, even without lights. Teresa Cosgrove is a local artist. She's been helping with the details of the painting. She's the one that painted all the little bolts gray so they would stand out. And And then recently, we had a wonderful in-kind from, actually from one of the very beginnings is Bernstein and Rain Marketing Group, and an instructor from the Art Institute, Francis Basta, has developed a concept with the idea of Inglewood being where art lives. And since we're using arts as the identity for the area, when you think about Hollywood, Hollywood isn't a store, Hollywood isn't a single person, Hollywood is a place. And Inglewood resonates a lot of that same idea, is now Inglewood isn't just a single store or a person, it's an entire community, and it's where arts lives. And so they came up with this concept for us. Since then, we've had a wonderful, recently retired sign maker who is now erecting and making these large Inglewood letters that will eventually go on the building that you see in the rendering on the bottom left. So we're really excited. The part that is in pink that says where art lives, that will be in neon. So it'll illuminate the white letters and really make it pop. And so you can see we've already started making the letters in 3D, and we'll hopefully have all of those finished soon. So here we are where the building is at now. I'm really excited to show you the mural that was created. There's over 49 faces from people that were just randomly selected in Inglewood. Most of them are citizens or they work in the Inglewood area. Some landscaping was created on the bottom left, but we will be going through and doing much more renovation than what you see in this photo. I'm also pleased to say that we got a wonderful in-kind where we got a huge discount on all 90 windows for the building. So the windows that you see in now are only temporary, and the permanent windows are on order, and we anticipate having those by the middle of January. And we're also working with the Metropolitan Community College. The students from that program will be helping install those windows as part of their certification through the technology campus there. And I just want to show that we've had all the many partners. This is just some of the many partners that have really stepped up to see what we're doing and have made generous donations or pledges or some commitment in one way or another. So we're just really proud and thrilled to be able to share these names. And then I want to end here kind of where we're at. This is a $2 million campaign to renovate and equip the building. To date, I'm thrilled to say we've crossed the $1 million threshold mark. So we're more than halfway to our goal. We need to raise about another 910,000, of which we have many other partners and proposals into other foundations that are being considered as we speak. So we're well on our way, but we need to continue to get the community support to ensure that we're able to complete the renovation of the Arts Center. We have a wonderful leadership group here. Monty Short as our executive director. I come to the organization as a former director of Belger Arts Center. And then we have currently this wonderful board, which I noticed, I did get it updated. We have two new board members, Thomas Meyer from Metropolitan Community College and Rachel Watkins from the Truman Heartland Community Foundation. So right now we have a board of 10 and we have a total of room for 15 board members altogether. So this is our website. I would encourage anybody that wants to connect and join the mailing list if you're not already, or to learn and get more updates or connect to our social media. It's inglewoodarts.art. And that's pretty much where we're at right now with the building. It's been gutted. We've done a lot of the taking out of things, and now it's time to put things into the building, including the windows and the paint, and really start forming the glass studio. So we anticipate having the first floor accessible with the glass and the performing arts by mid-spring. So we're still on track for that. And we hope with the pandemic and everything going on, we can continue to stay on track. And now I'd like to just kind of open it up for questions. If anybody has questions about the Art Center or just how this connects to the community.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Yeah, your progress has been tremendous, and it seems like not a couple weeks go by that we don't hear some other announcement of another contribution that you've received or a grant that you've won or a partnership that you've formed. So congratulations to everybody who's working so hard on this, on all of your success. Are there comments or questions from the council?
Madam Mayor, if I may.
Yes.
Go ahead, Dan.
I'll be real quick, John, because you know those folks better than I do. But Mr. Baxley, you know I'm a huge fan. I'm real excited that you came to tell us about this, and can't wait to see where you go with it. And I'm ready.
Thank you.
I'm ready. Thank you.
We are too. Thank you. We can't, I should mention that before I take another question, I want to mention one of the biggest supporters has been the City of Independence. Not for Inglewood Arts, but for Inglewood as a community. We recognize that the sidewalk improvements and the investment that the city made in Inglewood really sparked and was the catalyst to show improvement in the area that got a lot of the supporters. So when they came out to see the building, they saw that the sidewalks had been improved. They saw that there were bus stops with the benches and the bicycle racks. Those got a lot of notice. And so it got supporters to say, well, if the city sees that this is worth investing in, we do too. And it was really critical. And then being able to tell the supporters that the city council voted unanimously to sell us the building, that spoke highly to many foundations, especially the Sunderland Foundation, who was the first to pledge $300,000 to this project. So I just want to thank the city for all their support. Anytime I've needed something, I have to say several council members have reached out and offered their support and connected me in many different ways. The mayor has been terrific and the city manager. So you all have been really instrumental. For this to work, the city has to want it to. And you're showing it. So that's why it's working.
Okay, Councilman Perkins.
Thanks. If I jump in and say thanks, Michael, for your great leadership and our great leadership with our community partners. And this is actually a great example where the city can kind of step in and get things moving and get the hell out of the way and just let you folks get creative and do the things that you do there. And what a ripple effect this creates with the development that you guys are doing and getting into the community and lifting up the community and taking that ripple effect and bringing it to Fairmont and to the square, then the square back into Inglewood. It's just a ripple effect that goes everywhere. We had a on the roll committee meeting today discussing connectivity and how we can connect Truman Library to the first phase to Inglewood right at your doorstep and vice versa. So as you rise and bring the ripple effect, it just crosses over to the other areas of the community that just makes everybody just will lift up and get moving. So thank you for everything you've done.
Thank you, Councilman Perkins. Just the last thing I'll point out is the arts has played a key role in revitalizing communities. In downtown Kansas City, I was part of that movement of it being a ghost town. And I remember as a teenager riding a skateboard after all the business guys went home through the streets because nobody went downtown. And then later on, I remember as being a young college student having an art studio downtown because it was super cheap and nobody was down there. And so you could kind of do whatever you wanted. Once the arts kicked in, then all of a sudden people wanted to live there. And artists traditionally paved the way for others to see how it can be beautiful. And so, it's everybody working together. And I think it's important to realize that Inglewood Arts is a nonprofit. We want to do our part, but we are not going to revitalize Independence. And it doesn't work that way. We want to be the catalyst that then gets other players to come. And with the renovation of the library and what's going on in the square, it's the rising tide is raising all the ships, and we want to be just one of the many catalysts that make Independence great. And I'm glad to see that people are taking notice to what we're doing, but it's going to take other people and other initiatives to really support what we're doing. So we're encouraging what's going on throughout Independence, and we want to support other organizations. We want to support Habitat and what they're doing. We want to support the Square. Any way we can, and the library and Mid-Continent, all of those organizations are what's going to continue to make Independence great. So I'm just grateful to be one tiny part of it. And we hope that this will also help other organizations too.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for all you're doing, and don't hesitate to reach out if we can do more.
Great. Well, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate everyone's time this evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Finally, on our agenda tonight, very important report from our Advisory Board of Health, Mr. City Manager.
Yes, again, Madam Mayor and members of the council, a few weeks ago, the council asked staff to convene the Advisory Board of Health to zone in on some questions that were brought forward. Staff has convened the Advisory Board of Health to review the questions posed by the council. And this evening, Dr. Terry Morris is here to give a presentation to the council in response to that. So without further ado, I will defer to Dr. Morris to run through his presentation.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Dr. Morris, for being here this evening.
You're muted, Doc.
I think you're muted, Dr. Morris.
My 3-year-old grandson told me I was muted the other day on a Zoom, so.
We can hear you now.
I was just saying, Mr. Baxley's presentation made me smile, and my headache from the first presentation got better.
Yeah.
So, having ridden my bicycle through that neighborhood quite a lot in the last 40 years, I'm happy to see it blossoming. I'm here tonight as a representative from the Advisory Board of Health. And let's see, am I going to change? There we go. And basically, we're presenting a conversation about COVID-19 and a pandemic that we're all aware of. This slide is really just for people on City 7. The advisory board is set up for to advise the city manager, the Department of Health, and the city councils on matters pertaining to public health and some other duties that we from time to time are asked to perform. Currently, the advisory board is made of a dentist, who is the current board chair, 3 area physicians, 1 veterinarian, 2 RNs, an educator, a community member with medical experience, and we have 1 open position, which I believe we're getting ready to fill soon. Local health departments' core services are to deal with adult and childhood immunizations, communicable disease control, community outreach and education, and epidemiology and surveillance, all of which really have to do with our current COVID crisis. The advisory board was asked to examine 4 different questions which were really difficult. We've met several times. 1 was factors related to comprehensive community health, to report on the general economic and health impacts of COVID, the future outlook of health limitations to the community, and broad community input for decision making. In regards to factors related to comprehensive community health, unfortunately today we passed a new milestone. I thought it might not be till tomorrow, but this evening we did pass 300,000 deaths from COVID in the United States. All my data that I'm showing is 4 days old. I had to submit my slides on Thursday. Date on what's going on currently with our pandemic. Their coronavirus website is very, very helpful, very user-friendly. This is a slide that shows the 7-day moving average of daily confirmed cases. The green here is the United States, which is well above most other countries. Interestingly enough, this morning, Turkey, which is kind of a salmon color, is also up here. They've had a huge outbreak in the last week. You've probably seen this. This is the Mid-America Regional Council daily snapshot. It kind of shows the trends and what's been going on. The one that I pay the most attention to is hospitalizations. And as you can see, we've had kind of an ever increasing rise in hospitalizations. Currently, hospitals are at about 90% of their ability to take care of COVID patients. So we're really hoping that we don't get a big surge from our Christmas activities. This slide just has to do with Eastern Jackson County, not including Kansas City. So it's Independence, Blue Springs, Raytown. And as you can see, it's a 7-day rolling average. So for Eastern Jackson County, as of the 7th, we put in 33 new patients per day. And again, this is kind of an increasing average over time. It's important to talk a little bit about COVID-19 transmission. I'm sure all of you have heard this nightly on the news. I won't spend a horrible long time, but the big question is always who infects who? And the basic reproduction number for this particular illness is around 3, meaning on average, each person who gets infected with coronavirus will spread it to 3 other people. The problem is that's not necessarily the case. And we're seeing super spreading events. That means a single infected person spreads the virus to more than 10 people. And it seems to play a bigger role in the United States than we thought it was going to. There have been some really large super spreading events where between 10 to 100 people are infected. It's just more common than we anticipated. Super spreading events have shown us that as few as 10% of the affected people may drive 80% of the cases that we see. CDC estimates that 40% of transmission occurs before the infected person has any symptoms. So it's not a matter of somebody that knows they have COVID or suspects they have COVID, ignores what we ask them to do and goes out and spreads it. 40% of the time, they just went to the grocery store. So the risk factors to consider as far as how do you spread this is how many people are gathered together, the space, how close is the contact, how long is the exposure, is the location inside or outside. Now that the weather has gotten colder, we're moving towards the inside. Are there a lot of high touch surfaces? Are you in an area where you already have a high number of cases? And then an interesting word that was invented called COVIDosity, which is how likely is compliance with the safety measures that we encourage people to use. This is a local case report. It actually is one of my best friends. I'm having lunch with him tomorrow, so I'll tell him I told him about you. I told you about him. It was a family gathering to celebrate an 8th birthday. There were some relatives coming in from out of town. There were 13 adults, 2 teens, and 7 children. 2 adults actually had negative COVID tests before they came to the gathering. No one had any COVID symptoms, no runny noses, no fever, no sore throat, no cough. They had appropriate mask wearing. They only took their masks off to eat and drink, and they went through kind of a buffet for the party. It was marginal social distancing. It was in somebody's house. You get 20 some odd people in a house, it's going to be crowded. Every last person that attended that birthday party contracted COVID. One required hospitalization, ICU care, and mechanical breathing assistance. He was in about 2 weeks or so. He's been out now another 2 weeks. He was released from the hospital, but he still requires oxygen. And the long-term effects of his COVID illness is really unknown at this time. This is a little bubble chart. My daughters love bubble charts. Over here on your left side are low-risk things, going to get your takeout food, filling your car up with gas, using your friend's bathroom. Those are all pretty low risk. When you get over here towards the high risk side, it's going to church and singing. It's going to an indoor party. It's going to the bars. All of these depend on those factors that we talked about earlier. A report on general economic and health impacts you asked us to comment on. It's obvious to everyone that this pandemic has had a profound impact on service industries. Restaurants, bars, hotels, amusement parks have just taken a horrible hit. But analysis of the pandemic economics is really beyond the scope of purpose of the Board of Health, and they chose not to make a big comment on that. Hopefully you were able to attend a webinar that happened last week on the 8th. It was hosted by the Chamber of Commerce. It was a joint meeting between the Chamber of Commerce and the chief medical officers of local hospitals. That webinar is still online, and Christina Heinen, I believe, I sent her the link to that. So if it stays up, it's worth 60 or 70 minutes of your time to listen to what the CMOs of our local 7 hospital chains had to say about the pandemic. As far as the healthcare economic impact we can speak to, hospital revenues are mixed. Some of the larger chains are holding their own. Smaller chains, particularly rural hospitals, are really taking a huge hit. Many have been forced to close. Office-based physician and dental practices revenues are significantly decreased. My friends that are in practice have seen anywhere from a 30 to 50% reduction in patient visits and revenues. Physicians and nurses are retiring in record numbers, much faster than anyone ever anticipated, and that we were already looking at physician and nursing shortages. And physician offices are closing. The American Academy of Family Physicians suspect somewhere between 6 and 10% of physician practices will close by the time the pandemic is over. Health impacts on patients. We've seen a huge uptick in depression, anxiety, child abuse is up, domestic violence is up, loneliness is more pronounced, and grief is huge. As far as acute and emergency care goes, patients are not going in for acute chest pain. They're not seeking care for symptoms of a stroke. They're not seeking care for diabetic crisis and their blood sugar becomes elevated. Delay in diagnosis equals poorer outcomes. Office-based care, we're seeing decrease in immunizations. Patients are not going in to get their flu shots. They're not going in to get their other immunizations. Patients are putting off following up on their diabetes. They're failing to follow up on hypertension. We're seeing a decrease in mammograms and colon cancer screenings. And patients are failing to go to the doctor's office when they have new problems arise. Again, this is going to lead to poorer prognosis because of delayed care. Pediatric issues, we're seeing a decrease in routine immunizations. The concern about this is the decrease in herd immunity that we'll talk about again here in a moment, and that may lead to secondary epidemics. We're seeing a lack in preventative care. We're seeing an alarming increase in weight gain, partly due to, for some children, exercise at school was the only physical activity they had. We're also seeing an increase in depression, anxiety, and suicide. And there are some issues with food insecurity, where the meals that they got at school were really the meals that they got. As far as hospital care goes, we're seeing an unbelievable provider fatigue and shortages like we've never seen before. My friends that are on the front line can barely put one foot in front of the other. We're quickly approaching the unavailability of beds. Centerpoint HCA was sending all of their COVID patients to research. Research reached capacity and asked HCA to open a 12-bed COVID unit. They did that, I think it was 2 weeks ago Monday. That unit was full Monday afternoon. They now have somewhere around 25 COVID patients. Some of the hospitals are in the 90+% rate of having their beds full. So as flu season continues, and if we have a spike with Christmas, we're not going to have anywhere to put patients. Physicians are now going to be faced with having to make a decision on who gets care. You have two patients that both need hospitalization. They both need a ventilator. One is a 70-year-old grandpa who's got multiple comorbid conditions like me. The other is a 32-year-old mother of two. The mother of two is getting the ventilator. That's not a ethical dilemma that you want your providers to have to face. Sick patients that used to stay in the hospital are now being sent home on oxygen to make room for sicker patients. We've only got so many beds. You're probably going to do okay if we send you home, so we're sending you home. And although in the last few days the death rate has been down, overall we have seen a slight uptick in death rate. When the pandemic first started, the death rate if you were put in the hospital was 24 to 25%. A quarter of the patients who were hospitalized never made it out of the hospital. In the last 8 to 9 months, the medical community has had a huge increase in knowledge base as far as how to treat this, and the death rate is down significantly, probably 4 or 5%. But we're worried that we're going to see an increase. As far as the future outlook of health limitations in the community goes, that's a really, really good question. We don't know. It depends on lots of different things. It depends on the manufacture and distribution of the vaccine. First vaccine doses in the United States were given this morning. The challenges of distribution are just profound. There is a meeting tomorrow of the multi-agency coordinating group, and they're going to talk about vaccine distribution plans here locally. The hospitals are geared up. The plan is for first line physicians and nurses to get the first vaccines, and then nursing home providers and nursing home patients. An important concept of this is if you give 100,000 doses, you have to remember that in 3 to 4 weeks, a second dose is required, and you have to have another 100,000 doses. So when that second 100,000 doses shows up, it's already spoken for. We also need to remember that it's 8 weeks from immunization to immunity. When you get your first shot, you are less likely to get COVID, but you're not immune. When you get your second shot, you've got a pretty good chance of being immune, but you can't bank on that. This is a new vaccine technology, at least Moderna and Pfizer's vaccine are both something called messenger RNA vaccines. We've never had a messenger RNA vaccine before. The data looks pretty good. I looked at it this morning again. But you also have to remember when you look at this data, what Pfizer's data, they had, let's see, I wrote it down. They had 41,000 patients in their study. That means that 20,000 got the vaccine and 20,000 did not. They had 170 confirmed cases of COVID in the ones who received the placebo and 8 in the vaccine group. So that is very, very reassuring, but you're talking about 20,000 patients that got the vaccine. So as we give more vaccine, we're going to have a better idea of what the success rate is. And the whole key to the vaccine is that it depends on the willingness of the public to be vaccinated. This is a little slide from the Pew Research Center. If you look back here in May of 20, 72% of the population stated they would get the vaccine. About 27% said they wouldn't. Then politics got involved, and the acceptance rate went down to 51%, although I've seen it lower than that. Luckily now we're up to maybe 60%. A study I saw day before yesterday said we still may be down in the 50% range. And of those who said they don't want to get the vaccine, there's still a percentage who may want to get it. The future of making this pandemic go away is really on the public. It's not on the doctors, it's on the public. In order to make a vaccine work, it requires herd immunity. And herd immunity varies from disease to disease. We're all old enough that we all had measles vaccines, and measles was a horrible childhood illness, and adults who got measles also died. But it requires about 95% of the population to be immunized. If you drop below that, which we actually are seeing now, we're probably down to around 70%, you don't get herd immunity. For polio, it took about 80% of the population to be immunized against polio to get herd immunity. We don't know what that's going to be for COVID-19. We haven't given that many doses yet. So it's also going to depend on a willingness of the community to continue preventative measures. You can't have a false sense of security. You can't say, well, people are getting vaccinated, we don't have to worry about this anymore, because the disease is still there. We're still spreading it to one another. And even if you had the vaccine, it doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to get COVID. Interestingly enough, it means you may not get sick from it. But there are some very interesting studies now that say people may still have the virus in their nasal passages and may be able to pass the virus on to others, even though they're asymptomatic and they're not going to get sick from it. Broad community input for decision making. This is a hard one to comment on. Initially, when we started looking at this, when the advisory board met, we talked about Jackson County legislator. Most of you probably know Jeannie Lauer, Ron Finley, and Crystal Williams. They're on the Health and Environmental Committee for the county. And this is how you get hold of your county person. But interestingly enough, as of last week, you are the person that the community talks to. I think the most important thing is for us to understand that this is going to be a slow cure. A lot of us are really excited. Physician buy-in as far as getting immunization at Centerpoint. The CMO told me about 97% of the physicians there felt that this was the way to go and they would be immunized. Hopefully the public will buy into this and that we can make this pandemic go away. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. Are there comments or questions from the council?
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Councilman.
Dr. Morris, I appreciate you stepping forward. I watched all your meetings and I know you volunteered to put the slides together and do the research for your group. So I do appreciate you taking the time to do so. It means a lot to us. You know, when I first requested that your committee start meeting on a regular basis because we didn't have a health department. And what my hope was, because I just do nothing but read about this all the time. So I know I'm not a doctor, but I've read about a lot of things that I have questions and concerns about. My hope was that, you know, and part of me I feel bad because sometimes I think we got confused that critical thinking became criticism of what we were trying to achieve and accomplish. And all I want to do is just, when we talk about that broad community input, I wanted to ask you just a few questions that I think might stimulate more conversation for your committee. I was curious, have you heard of a Dr. Corey with the FLCCC, which stands for Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance?
Nope, that's one I've missed.
Okay, so this gentleman is a lung doctor and an ICU doctor. So they have a group of physicians who, like you, are very concerned about what's taking place in the COVID world. And so they've been focusing on existing repurposed drugs. And his group have accumulated mountains of data, which has emerged from centers and countries around the world showing the miraculous effectiveness of ivermectin. Are you familiar with this drug?
I've never used that in my practice. Can you spell it for me?
Yes, sir. ivermectin. Ivermectin. It has a human use and a veterinarian use. I know that you have someone on the committee who is a veterinarian, so this should give you some interesting conversation as well. But he says, this Dr. Corey says that it basically obliterates transmission of this virus. He says, if you take it, you will not get sick. It's a pretty big claim. But he says he has enough studies. He's asking for everyone involved to really look at the data and look and see what the effects are. It was noted that 2 researchers won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2015 for their studies on ivermectin's efficiency in eradicating parasitic diseases. And now it is proving to be an immensely powerful antiviral and anti-inflammatory agent. And so the peer review of the new ivermectin studies, it seems to say that this could be, he calls it a wonder drug. And so when I read things like this, I get a little excited because to me, these are the foot soldiers in the place where care is often critical, where they're seeing very difficult situations. And he said he just can't take any more death. And by the time people are getting to him, they are near death, and there's just no helping them. But if this is something that we can have a discussion about with our medical community, and it has any hope of helping do just what he described, I think it's worth the discussion. Wouldn't you?
There have been a number of drugs that have come up that have been touted by various people as being cure-alls. I think the important thing to understand about the Advisory Board of Health, and I'm no longer speaking for the Advisory Board of Health because we haven't had this conversation, is that none of us are epidemiologists, none of us are virologists, none of us are pulmonologists, none of us are intensivists. I was a women's health physician. We have a family physician, and we have 2 family physicians at the time. So we've never done any investigative work on these particular drugs. That investigative work typically happens in tertiary care centers. It's typically reviewed by national boards, FDA, CDC, that sort of event. So we certainly can take a look at that. Like I said, there's been numerous drugs that have been touted. Mechanism action of an anti-parasitic drug and an antiviral drug. It's kind of like saying, this works well to fix Chevrolets, let's try it on your cows. They're not the same organisms. And so it makes it difficult to see the parallel there. but we certainly can talk about that and can try to provide you information about that.
Well, I'm not asking for an endorsement, but a conversation I think is a wonderful thing. And unless we don't think it's worthwhile to look at, but I find it fascinating that the veterinary ivermectin has more profound effects in humans than the other way around. But this doctor was testifying in front of the Senate and said, and he was begging for his research, which he says he has mountains of evidence to show that ivermectin is life-saving and protective and is so immense, and the drug is so safe it must be instituted and implemented. I have reservations about the vaccine because of the mRNA, and so I think something that was basically quick tested to the market, which normally a new vaccine takes between 2 and 10 years, is what I've been told by some medical professionals. And I'm a little concerned about anything that's going to reprogram DNA in our vaccines.
Messenger RNA vaccines don't actually reprogram DNA at all. That's not the way they work.
Okay. Well, they're not in any other vaccine, as you stated earlier, and I think people are concerned, and maybe rightfully so, because we were told initially it was would take 2 years to bring the vaccine to market, and it's basically been tested 2 months. And here we
Yeah, the 3 vaccines that are most likely going to be on the market are the 2 messenger RNA vaccines, and then there is a 3rd vaccine that was actually developed for a previous SARS. The official name of COVID-19 is actually SARS-CoV-2, and there was a previous SARS outbreak that had come about and luckily went away. And there was a vaccine that was in development for that SARS vaccine. And so basically they just modified that work to work for SARS-CoV-2. Messenger RNA is a different technology and doesn't take as long to develop. And that's why, well, there's 2 reasons it went so fast. One is because the government threw a bucket load of money at it. And so they could actually afford to produce it and develop it and trial it in a quicker manner than they have. Time will tell. Like I said, medications that have been touted as being extremely effective have not borne out. The term mountains of data always concerns me because I've never seen the data. And I'm a data person, so I spend 2 or 3 hours every day looking at data. And so I'm happy to take a look at the mountains of data and get it to somebody that can read it better than I can.
I would encourage you to do so. I also wanted to just kind of hit on what you were talking about with the children. I read that we have 15 million more people who are facing hunger in 2020. That's 1 in 6 people, and 1 in 4 children are hungry right now. We've served 4.2 billion meals, which is a 60% increase in the number of people using a food bank, and about 40% of the people who visited the food bank are first timers. I worry about nutrition. Children are not getting the nutrition. They're not getting exercise the way that we have them in homes. I worry about their social development. All of these are the topics that I was hoping that we could talk more about. And because when us as a council, we're looking at the city from a 10,000 foot perspective. What do we need to be thinking about, talking about to care for the oldest to the youngest in the city? And so that's kind of why I'd asked those questions, is just to try to spark some of those discussions with your committee. I hope you understand that.
Sure.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions for Dr. Morris? Yes.
I had a couple things. Dr. Morris, one of the concerning things, I'm glad your friend's all right. I'm just trying to figure this out. And I am a mask wearing, hands cleansing all the time. So we had this family gathering on the 8th birthday, and all these people come down with it, but yet they wore their mask and everything. I can't understand what went wrong. So mitigation evidently is not working, or something went wrong there. But just my biggest concern here that I was hoping you would touch on too is the mental health issues. 1 in 8 ER related things was pre-pandemic was mental health. And we just barely touched on that. And that's my biggest thing is, you know, the effect of this loneliness and all that stuff, depression, anxiety, substance abuse. I mean, suicide rates are just going nuts out here. You know, and I just wish that we could touch a little bit more on the other effects. I realize this is a very, very dangerous thing here we're playing with, but I'd really like to see in the future that maybe we touch on some of these other things and how it's affecting people along with what's going on here. Because I know the suicide rate is, I read an article yesterday, day before, it's overwhelming, and premature death basically is what we're talking about, you know, and appetite, you touched on it a little bit, and trouble sleeping and stuff like that. I just like to dig into that a little bit more with your committee and see something come out of that, hit it a little bit harder. I think it's a very important topic to discuss myself.
I don't disagree with that at all. Unfortunately, I think what did you say? What percentage did you say went to the ER because of mental health?
1 out of 8
in my days in the ER, about 50% of patients were there because of mental health issues. They put their fist through the wall. They put their fist through their spouse's face. They got drunk. They rode their motorcycle without their helmet on. They were driving 90 miles an hour. You know, it's unfortunately, mental health is poorly paid for by health insurance. Even the best insurance policies pay for 50% of a mental health visit. We have no mental health providers whatsoever in the community. They're profoundly difficult to come by. They usually say, here's a pill, take this and come back and see me in a month. Your ability to get cognitive therapy is almost non-existent. The first thing to get cut when we do budget cuts is mental health services.
Sure, and that's what we really need to concentrate on. When we see it out here, we got homelessness all over this city, and it's not getting any smaller no matter what we do. And that has to do with the mental health part of this. And so I just think it has a big effect, you know, on this pandemic. Definitely has a big effect on this. And just like, I think it's very important for us to discuss this sometime. So I thank you for your presentation. It was great.
Madam Mayor, if I may.
Yes, Councilman Perkins.
Thank you, Dr. Morris, for bringing us the presentation and the data that you acquired to do. That's the information that we need, that we know is a conventional thought to help give us some ideas and how we can formulate our policies and stuff. And I think the city has done a pretty good job trying to think ahead before the pandemic took place of how can we get people outside, how can we get them activated, how can we get them connected. So with our walking trails, biking trail systems, I mean, that's part of the discussions of getting people outside that our epidemiologists have talked about from the national level all the way down from the beginning of this thing, to get people outside and moving and enjoying, even though they have to get locked down for school and other places. So I think we're on the right path of getting some of these projects moving forward to help get people outside and exercise and moving. That's part of the mental health and the physical well-being and happiness for sure. So again, Dr. Morris, thank you for all your work that you've done on this. It's quite amazing. We're a fortunate community to have someone of your caliber willing to put your expertise to work. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, any other comments or questions for Dr. Morris?
Just wanted to say,
Oh,
I just wanted to say real quick, pardon me, Mr. Starmeyer. Mr. Morris, thank you for serving in your capacity, volunteering for the city. And please thank the members of your committee for this. We really do appreciate it.
Will do.
Thank you. Councilman Steinmeier?
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Hobart, for interrupting. Didn't mean to. Love technology. So, Mr. City Manager, you had told me the first quarter I'd asked you about just the environmental impact and cleanup of our community from the homelessness. You had told me that in the first quarter we had spent $60,000 unbudgeted on the environmental cleanup. Do you have updated numbers for this quarter?
I do not, but I can get that relatively easy for you. There's been a little bit of a slowdown on that, not certainly because of the demand, but the CDC guidelines relative to touching and such have kind of mitigated our partnership with MoDOT on that. So a little bit of that slowed down, but nevertheless, I could get that fiscal impact for you.
Well, the reason why I've asked is today I was driving around some of the hot spots for our homeless encampments, and we have trash everywhere again. It's bad. And so I know this is an unbudgeted issue, but it is also a health concern. These folks are in our community, they're out and about. And so, it's an expense to the city, but I want to stay on top of this the best we can. And if you could give us quarterly updates of what it's costing us, this will help this council make decisions and for future policies as well.
Very good.
Councilman Steinmeier, if I could just offer a comment on that. We should expect to see homelessness go up significantly here in the next 90 days. Now, assuming that the rent moratorium, the eviction moratorium goes away, we're going to have a number of people living in their cars and they're looking for places to park. And it's going to be shopping center parking lots and neighborhood streets. That's not a topic I can fix, or nor can our community fix, our council fix. It's going to go far beyond, and I expect before the pandemic is over, which hopefully if we get buy-in, by spring or so, we'll be seeing some loosening up and some better times. But in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of people looking for a place to stay warm.
100% agree, Dr. Morris. I 100% agree with your comments. Shared concerns, and I wish we were equipped as a city to do more, because we know that a lot of the homeless issues are mental health or extreme addictions, cross addictions. There's just so much that's facing us. Anything you can bring that will help us to address it, always appreciate it. Thank you.
Mr. City Manager, well, first of all, I want to say I think that was a very important point, Dr. Morris. These are not things that we can solve. These are things that we just have to try to the best of our ability, contain and do what we can in response to this. None of us caused the coronavirus. But we have to cope with the consequences of it beyond the physical ailment and, in the worst case scenarios, death or long-term disability. And all these things are just certainly aggravated by the impacts of this virus on many, many things, on quality of life, on mental wellness, on ability to keep a roof over your head and keep food on the table. And we're all struggling with those realities. What I was going to ask Mr. City Manager, very early on in this pandemic, the county determined to utilize the Salvation Army camp at 40 Highway and Lee Summit Road, which is technically within the city limits of Kansas City, as a COVID, as a place for those without secure housing who are COVID positive to be quarantined at that spot so that they could be contact traced if they tested positive. The reports that we received from the county during the period of time that was being utilized for that purpose was there were a very small handful of people who actually accessed that resource. I think the reports I recall seeing, there was one person who was being accommodated at the Salvation Army camp. I know in Kansas City they made some hotels available for COVID positive people. I would like to perhaps revisit that, if you would, with the county administrator. COVID positive or not, people need a place to be. And I certainly don't want to mix people who are known to be infected or spreaders with those who are trying to prevent themselves from getting sick or have been fortunate enough not to get sick. But that seems like a available resource. It's not under our control. It's not in Independence, but it sits square in the middle of our community. And I would encourage you to have a discussion with the county administrator and see if that is a facility that might be made available for folks who need a place to be.
I'd be happy to do so. We'll reach out tomorrow and initiate that conversation.
Okie dokie. Any other comments or questions for Dr. Morris? Okay, Mr. City Manager, do you have anything else this evening?
I do not. Thank you.
Okay, then we are adjourned. Thank you very much.